It's computer. Hello,
Okay, I
welcome
got it.
to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Mike Buhl. And welcome to the podcast again.
Thank
Uh,
you.
we were earlier going back and forth about a recent show on German television, ZDF, which is Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen, which means the
Yeah.
second German television channel. And they have these political talk shows, and Markus Lanz, he's one of the moderators, reporters, and he, has this show every like 3 times a week, and he invites guests in politics, in philosophers, intellectuals, journalists a lot, and it's just about talking, contemporary political issues.
Yeah.
And so he's also running a podcast with a guy named Richard David Precht. He's um,
Yeah.
a public intellectual philosopher in Germany, and they were talking about this big issue of universal basic income, and also in connection with the threat of automation, and and this debate seems to have advanced. I mean, you listened to that show as well.
Oh yeah.
Last few months.
I like you. I plug into German public television as much as I can, and Richard Precht is a philosopher that has this side to him where he's very talkative and he can make what seems like sophisticated concepts into simple concepts. And if I recall on that show, there was an intense discussion about the idea of work itself. And he was trying to do something of a, like I would say, historical analysis of what Arbeit is, and how the word itself has changed. So Arbeit is work, right? And I recall the debate and discussion he had with the other contributors of even the word and its meaning has changed in context of Roman society, where there were people that were emancipated from having to do manual labor, and then there were the ones that were like the slaves, and they're totally different divide based on your location, right, in the social system. And nowadays, there's still a ambiguous usage of the word work. Whether we think of it as leisure activities or something like laboring, really physically intensive, or are we talking about hourly work, salary work? And I think what Precht was trying to argue is we're still stuck in the 19th century when it comes to work, and we're not really thinking in the terms of 21st century, and that we need to make the word work more flexible and even have some kind of sin. Like that, he uses that word a couple of times in the discussion, and that's where that basic income idea comes in a couple of times, that they could emancipate us from the whole idea of work as a kind of alienation, and you're doing it just for money's sake. But for sin, it has some purpose, and it might be multi-purpose, multifunctional, and it might be differentiated work that is the future too. I mean, tasks, simple tasks, whether it's in roles that we take as public intellectuals or artists, or assisting in the public realm, right? I think the example he used in the talk show, I don't know, help me out here. In the talk show, he brings up the example how there's this drain in the health professions, particularly they don't have enough volunteers, and there's basic income might be an incentive for people to engage in work that is usually voluntary based.
Right, just on this latest point,
Yeah.
I would say in Germany, so they used to have mandatory service in the military. They had the draft, and that was active from, you could say, the end of World War II, when they were setting up the West German military to
Bundeswehr.
basically the Bundeswehr to oppose the East Germans and the Soviet Union at that point. And then in 2011, the government stopped the draft. They didn't abolish the draft, but they stopped executing it. And that, this is, one of the problems, you could say, with respect to, countering foreign threats like we see in Eastern Europe today. We're going to talk about that in a bit. But
Yeah.
but the biggest problem was the so-called Wehrersatzdienst, right, which is the
Civil service, right?
the civil service in English is a different meaning. I would say it's like the conscientious objectors service, which is usually with with the social services, with the health services, being like an ambulance driver,
Yeah.
being in the hospital or hospice,
Nursing home.
like nursing home, health service support. And so because, young men who would deny or reject the draft, the military service, because they sign paperwork that says they don't want to own weapons, they don't want to touch it for political, personal, religious reasons or whatever, and they would then be deployed in the social service sector as, you could say, mandatory laborers,
and get compensated, right?
And get compensated for it. And there's a similar system in Austria, but in Austria they didn't stop the draft, so the young men are still flowing into these social service and health service industries, but at a compensation level that is much lower than full-time workers in the health and social service sector, right? So Brecht's perspective, interestingly, he talks about the Soziales Pflichtjahr, right, which is the idea of a mandatory social year. That is to say, instead of having, a mandatory military draft where if you rejected that service, you could be deployed in the social health service sector, you would be drafted straight into the health and social service sector. I think that was sort of one of his ideas with young men, but then also with old people. Interestingly, his idea was to draft old people in the year before they retire to also do a mandatory, social and health service oriented work, kind of like mandatory community service, if you want to put it that. And like his idea is, so the German word is Pflicht, right, which is kind of like an obligation.
Arbeitspflicht.
He wanted to. So his idea of like civitas, right, the Latin word, where we derive the word citizen from. A citizen is somebody who has certain rights, the right to vote, the right to speak and assemble, and political involvement, etc. But a citizen is also somebody who has an obligation to his or her community, and one way to show that you are fulfilling that obligation is by mandatorily working, in the social service sector. But to that point about, the why is he sort of advocating, this, I don't know, mandatory, social year, that service. It's about the point that you raised earlier about what is this idea of work, which is, I think he derived it from the original Latin word facere, which means to make, to do something. And his argument is that, our human motivation to do something, to reshape the natural environment, to reshape, our, human or social relations with other people, through, teaching and learning and caring and things like that, is what you might consider to be a natural activity. That is to say, we would do them whether or not we get paid to do it, right? Just like, you and I, I'm not receiving any money for the podcast, and you are not either, right? So yet we are both,
participating or
participating in it, because
some kind of activity, right?
right, it's a leisure activity, and we believe that
it has value.
It has value because some people are going to listen to it, right? Now, however many it's going to be, I mean, I'm not sure, but I guess the idea is that there are certain activities that people are going to do, even without the monetary compensation, but we cannot appreciate this kind of work properly as a society unless there's a basic income. Because the basic income is sort of a, you could say, a transfer policy where, we're taking the stuff that gets produced that still requires compensation, like, I don't know, I mean, usually work that nobody really likes to do. I mean, like taking out the trash, or I mean, or in some cases, are difficult to do, but are still very valuable, like, teaching, or being a doctor, medical services, etc. And we are basically allowing some redistribution to individuals that want to be useful and productive to the community, but can usually not command a market wage. And that's what the basic income should be doing. And then there's this argument that, well, isn't a basic income unfair to what you might call the primary producers, the people who are basically paying all of the taxes to sustain the basic income system.
Right.
And well, Precht's response, I think this is very fair, and I totally agree with it, is about the automation revolution. I mean, in a society where, let's say, 90% of the people were farmers, probably your and my ancestors were all farmers. I mean, if you go back more than 3 generations, I'm pretty sure, we can probably state that. And yet, we were still, our ancestors were still on the brink of starvation. I mean, even with, all of our labor input to produce food. And yet today, I mean, we have, one of the worst, obesity crisis, not just in America, but you see it in the European countries and all over the world. Well, except in, the very poor countries like in East Africa, it's probably more on the starvation side. But in a lot of parts of the world that is integrated into global market economy, we're seeing food surpluses. And we're seeing a shrinking percentage of the population in agriculture. So
that's good.
Yeah. So the main assumption that the Precht is making is about the technologically induced abundance of today's world, and we are
surplus.
Right. We're figuring out how to redistribute that. But yeah.
I'm curious. My question is with Precht. He does use a lot of historical analysis. So my question is if, unless I misunderstood him, but he seems to focus both on a system analysis and at times a class analysis. So he kind of uses both of those as entry points. From his system analysis, there's different systems, whether feudalism and early capitalism to modern day capitalism and automation, but it's system. I'm trying to figure out if he focuses on the systems that themselves that have evolved and changed over time, and then to some extent, every system had a limitation, or every system had a contradiction in its place. And even today, in the modern system, we're talking about a world system, right, with abundance of wealth and still a class problem, you know, and how all these people are supposed to be absorbed back into it, back into the world system. And actually, I'm thinking the reserve army of labor theory that comes back in my mind, how with automation, you know, you have not the need to have so many workers. It's not a need. You don't have to have many workers. That creates the paradox that you'll have a reserve army of people and a redundant population, you know, that's not absorbed back into the institutions, or without a basic income in place, or without a welfare system in place. So I think when I read or you know follow Precht, he kind of does both. He does a system critique of whatever time period, and then he does sort of a class approach. Um, and that's why he got in a fight with the Economist in that TV show,
Yeah,
because
and her name is Monica Schnitzer. So because
yeah, she's an economist from University of Munich, and what they were fighting about is what view do you have of automation? And I recall from her perspective, the view was that actually, you know, there will always be jobs, and it would just the jobs would be shuffled around, and you don't have to worry about it. Precht has somewhat more of a dystopian critical view, and he thinks that if there is no basic income in place, then we should be worried. But some economists think more that things will just sort of work out themselves, supply demand kind of idea, markets kind of produce equilibrium, and work will always be there. So I think Brecht was somewhat critical, and also was, you know, challenging this view, particularly the elderly. I think he made a reference. He because the view was, you know, we're getting older too, right? So people are going to be getting older, and how old, you know, will you be when you still work, or what would be the retirement age? And they were talking about different branches of the economy that old people might be able to go into, and he and not all, you know, branches, or I mean, some jobs physically are exhausting. I mean, service sector, a 65-year-old working in a service sector kind of environment is unrealistic, he would say, you know. Maybe a 65-year-old volunteering in a hospital, or even as kind of a advisory board. But many of the jobs we think of nowadays, they're so intensive, physically exhausting, that that's probably for 25 to 45-year-olds. But the older generation, you know, with automation, why don't we just eliminate those brutal jobs and just have a basic income? You know, like don't put much physical pressure on people. And that might be something, maybe it's utopian. Some people say, oh, you're utopian, that's robots can't do everything. But even in the field of trucking, we see more and more autonomous trucking development, warehouses being automated fully. So the physical labor and this, you know, physically exhausting labor that is so much still exists in our economy could be reduced further. And one way I think we could do it is tax automation. You know, like in cities tax technology, so that source of money is circulated back into some kind of basic income because we have the technology. That's my argument. My argument would be that automation, we could tax automation. And so that money that is saved by hiring less labor should flow back into some kind of income fund. Or
right,
that's my idea.
and
Yeah,
also, you know, as time goes on, I mean, it should be easier and easier to fund basic income, right? As more and more labor gets automated, because you're having to redistribute less labor hours to the population. I think Schnitzer, so she's a mainstream economist, as you say, they operate according to, a mental model of society, right? And the mental model is built on the concept of scarcity, right? So it's the idea that, um, so like if you're in the abstract, right? Let's imagine all of the people who are currently employed at a job put down their work, right? So they don't go to the office, they don't go to the factory and or to the field or whatever. Um, what would happen? Well, I mean, there would be a societal collapse, right? I mean, at that point, if you're trying to cash in your UBI check, basically paper money or whatever, PayPal or whatever else, it's not going to be worth anything um, because the crops are getting rotten on the field. Nobody collects it. Nobody redistributes the crops to the supermarket. Nobody stands in the supermarket to sell the product, and so on and so forth. Um, and and of course that's of course true. I mean, we cannot deny that this kind of labor scarcity still exists in today's economy. But it's all about the balance. Think about political debates not as one or zero. Like I don't know, like a computer, operating according to very seemingly stupidly simple um, arithmetic here. But think of it as a tendency, right? So again, I want to make the comparison between that, the pre-industrial era, the height of the industrial era, which is the middle of the 20th century, and the post-industrial era in which we're living today, where basically the amount of labor. So I mean, it's not zero that's required to sustain economy and society at current standards of living, but it is much less than what we would find, let's say, at the height of the industrial era.
Agreed. Yeah.
And in fact, going back to David Graeber's argument, the late David Graeber, anthropologist, who talks about the rise of bullshit jobs and bullshit occupations, which, I mean, of course, you could say, well, it's highly subjective about what is a BS job, because as long as somebody, on the demand side is shelling out money to purchase a service, it can't be bullshit, right? But every one of us, particularly in the white collar sectors of the economy, has experienced a great degree of bullshit in our working lives. I mean, the favorite example that I could come up with is emails, right? So yeah, every one of us is sort of dreading it when we sort of wake up in the morning, and I would say usually about 8:30 to 9. That's when the first emails start flooding in, right? The mailbox, and I get on average between 10 to 15 a day, and it's only one or two of them that are like addressed directly to me that require urgent action, right? Like like you and me confirming a meeting, or like a journal article revision or something like that. But most of the rest of the emails are like institutional emails, right? It's like, hey, I'm reminding you that there's an event that's upcoming or whatever, and I know I'm not going to attend it, but I'm still a listserv.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah,
there's different like multiple layers are created, inflated, and I think Graeber's argument is that these are not needed professions or not needed layers. Like you say, I mean, there's double jobs created to enforce others, and so yeah,
there's tasks that are not needed at all,
not necessary. Yeah. Yeah. I wonder, even in the housing sector, real estate, there's a multiple levels and layers that exist in that industry. Not just the realtor itself, but the people that permit, that look at the quality of a home. So some sectors, there's like a bubble that explodes, and there's really not clear what value specific jobs bring, and if they're just invented and created, right? So like, yeah, that's I think Graeber is right. I mean, there's a bullshit job sector that flourishes, expands, and then we see sometimes the crisis, when that people see that the value of those jobs are so much attached to other jobs that were also attached to other jobs, right? In academia, I think Chris, I'm trying to remember her name, Miss Liu, she wrote the professional managerial class within universities and colleges. Also think about branching out of the academic institutions. There's all these layers of professional staff, part-time staff who make the university. Catherine Liu, that's her name, Catherine Liu. And so institutions kind of grow, and there's, like you say, it's questionable what actual use do these professions have, other than they're on paper, right? They're not needed on paper. So creates a bubble within certain sectors, right?
Right. I mean, it's the important
Yeah.
connection that Graeber wanted to make is you could say the connection between the economy and the spirit level. That is to say, spiritually, we need to be working, or otherwise we should feel guilty, right? So this is an old Christian idea, and of course the early American cultural dominance was by the so-called Puritans. Well, it's not just
work
them,
ethic.
but yeah, I mean, it's broadly various Protestant groups that were trying to escape the persecution from the Anglican Church in England, and the Catholic Church, and in the continental European countries, and and I guess the idea, the crucial idea with work is that you have to be working, you have to be sort of suffering to some extent, and if you don't do it, then you should feel guilty about yourself, that you are sort of laying on the dole, you are
Unproductive.
Yeah, you're unproductive, you're leeching off the rest of society, and so on and so forth. And because of that ideological fixation, so if you combine the ideological fixation with wage labor, with the advancing levels of automation in the productive sector of the economy, you are going to face increasing calls for the artificial, or for the sustainment of artificial jobs, jobs that are not directly productive, but they fulfill some paper criteria, and that's that proliferates.
Dalton Conley wrote The Everything Ethic. I don't know, recall if you've ever read his approach. He kind of, Dalton Conley.
Yeah, he's my professor, yeah.
Oh, yeah, The Everything Ethic. I think he called it The Everything Ethic. It's a kind of reconstruction of this Protestant ethic idea, but in modern society, it kind of explodes. And I wonder, if you look at a figure like Elon Musk, this multitasking and new venture billionaire class of, he's in this sector, then he's in this sector, then he's going to buy Twitter, then he's going to produce the next electric car, that this is a hyper Protestant ethic that's visible in the billionaire class, that, that you can do everything. You can go on Mars, you can go into space travel, and this is idealized in some extent, I think, in the business culture, this hyper multitasking. I mean, it's really amazing if you think about it, in the different sectors that Elon Musk is in, and that this is embraced to some extent too, that people are going in different sectors. And I wonder, if this is moved by the culture too, by a new kind of capitalist culture, a new spirit that's striving that anything is possible, that you could be in space and you can work on electric cars, and then you're now going to be Twitter, partly Twitter owner. It's a different kind of Protestant ethic. It's anything goes, you know, and okay, what direction that goes, we're not sure, but it does is a hyper kind of economic spirit. I don't know if we want to call it that, but I like the way Dalton Conley calls it the everything ethic. And it also places burdens on individuals because they are trying to do all these things at once, and they're multitasking, and they're online, and they have physical jobs they go to, but then they're also on social media, right? They're just think of us as academics. I mean, we're constantly navigating between academic talk, and then we also have personal lives, but technology enables us to create hybrid or parallel worlds, which puts a lot of strain on us individually, right? I mean, we're bombarded. So I don't know. It places emphasis on agency, but not enough analysis on structures. I think people still kind of ignore the constraints of structures. They embrace agency and, oh, we can do all these things. That's my take of it.
Well, let me just.
I might disagree. You might disagree.
Yeah, well, let me just analyze Musk because
Yeah.
he's a very interesting, polarizing figure, and I've listened to some of his podcasts, and he's incredibly gifted, and it has to be said that this kind of gift, which he had early on, obviously, when he grew up in South Africa, it would be very difficult to realize this sort of creativity in full in back home in South Africa, right? It was so the way how he came to America was his mom was Canadian, and so he first went to college in Canada, and then he went to UPenn and in America, and that was his first step into the American business world. And he was one of the investors and co-founders in PayPal, and then he gradually acquired the funds to sort of build the projects that he really wanted to create, which is the electric car business and the space exploration. And then now the latest obsession, of course, is Twitter, because he sort of recognizes that basically, I mean, the whole idea of the billionaire class, if we want to call them that, which includes
Bernie Sanders terms, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, but there's a group of people. I mean, Jeff Bezos would be another one, and there's a handful of people. I mean, probably the other big tech companies in Silicon Valley, the bosses would also be part of that vision, is to gradually extend control over society and economy. I mean, think of like an octopus with multiple tentacles.
That's a good metaphor. I like
and the more tentacles. I actually got the metaphor from an Italian mafia TV series, which is called La Piovra, which is the octopus, which is the idea is basically that that the Italian state is undermined by the mafia. The mafia is like this octopus with tentacles that control all of the arms of government, and then thereby sort of undermining the regular operations of society and the economy. The American oligarchs, or the billionaire class, is evidently trying to do something similar, and they sort of have their own little niches, like Bezos with his Amazon, and the one-click shop, basically, the idea that, and one-day shipping and things like that. The idea that shipping should be convenient and simple and easy. And and Bezos, sorry, and Musk now, um, well, he's trying to extend the barriers, and that is currently possible. Like, for instance, space exploration. That's one field where NASA was active, obviously, after the end of World War II, but has been less so in the recent past because the threat of the Soviet Union fell away, and the American government became less interested in doing that. But yeah, the satellite projects, and then now Twitter, because it turns out that Twitter is the global commons. That is where we spend much of our time, and we communicate. And well, the reason that he said that he wanted to own Twitter is because he thinks that freedom of speech is being restricted. Because what happened was, since the 2016 elections, we've seen the backlash against the social media companies because we allow whatever, racist, sexist, homophobic speech by, you could say the political right wing. And so there was this backlash against the social media companies, and then the social media companies, to please that crowd, they had to sort of censor some material. They had to take out some material they didn't like. And now there's this pushback from the other side, and it's important to say that Musk is not, a classic, Trump-like right winger. I mean, I think that's going too far. But he's sort of taking this idea of we want to preserve free speech by all means possible, and that's his
philosophy.
right. That's his rationale to sort of go in and take over Twitter. Now, but then it's a big question whether. So his idea is that he has to take the company private, that is, say, Twitter private, in order to realize the free speech vision that he has. And I was wondering, why do we need a single person, the supposed wisdom of a Platonic king, of a benevolent dictator, to create this, so-called free speech platform?
Well, my idea, and of course, I have more of a conflict critical kind of perspective anyway. The rise of a kind of new economic elite class. And I think, again, Neckel, my favorite German sociologist, he had this term he threw around a lot, this refeudalization of modern capitalism. I think it's visible in the refeudalization of professions and this billionaire class. If you think of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, double dipping, triple dipping into various sectors at one point. So I always wondered, new monopolies are being formed right in front of our faces. I mean, it's not just segregated in one sector of the economy, but literally it engaged in multiple sectors. So
how would you describe the feudal structure? Because not everybody in our audience is a sociologist, so maybe you have to help us out here.
Well, and I recommend actually the article that Neckel wrote, Feudalization of Modern Capitalism. He borrowed the term originally from Habermas. Habermas was talking about this kind of refeudalization of the public sphere, and media industries were being consolidated rapidly, and there wasn't hope for democracy. And I think if you look at economic concentration and the ways in which incomes have, separated radically the last 20, 30 years, there is refeudalization as far as, the wealth problem. income divide, and the global class, money concentrated increasingly in the hands of very few. And I think if you just look at the amount of money that Elon Musk made in 1 year, I don't remember his earnings, his estimated earnings, or I'm gonna guess, I think it's 400 billion. I don't know, maybe it's less than that, but it was a significant amount. And so that in itself, the word refeudalization, we're dealing with a process that reminds us of the feudal past. It's not the same thing as feudalism, but neo-feudalism, a new kind of feudalism that we have an economic aristocratic class, an economic elite, and they are the movers of the system. They are they're the ones that make the big investments. They're the ones that have the big companies. We know those companies, right? Even social media companies, or the car companies, things like this with Elon Musk's Tesla cars, right? But that's the idea, I think, of refeudalization of the economy, and the refeudalization of professions too. What I mean by that, that term I kind of use, that some people may criticize. It means that even the jobs are kind of, there's some that are really paid really good, and then there are some jobs that are paid really bad. So there's really no middle income range, and we can see this often even in professional sports. This select few that make a whole lot of money, and then the rest of the sports kind of sector, most people like coaches that I used to work with, that actually make poverty wages. There's a lot of people in the sports kind of field, if they're high school coaches or if they're assistant coaches at colleges, they don't often make that much. But there's a crop of individuals that make a whole lot of money, a small select. So even in the area of sports, we see kind of a refeudalization process. And if that word is a problem, let's just say consolidation. There's a kind of divide and polarization of income. On the other hand, there's people get paid significantly less. If you think about inflation, if people work in the real economy, service sector job, they're losing money just by the fact of costs to drive to work, and cutting hours, things like that. But if you think of other sectors, they're flourishing. Even real estate right now.
Well, the important sociological relationship, I believe, in feudalism it's a dependence relationship, right? It's about
paternalistic, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's a pater, so there's a father, basically a person at the center, and everybody else, that is to say the so-called 99%.
Yeah.
We are basically servants to that lord, and we have to pay fealty to that lord,
or rent.
Right. As you might be able to tell, lots of academics, if you are jumping from temporary lecturing contract to temporary contract, or if your job exists because of a research grant, which means that every year you are justifying your basically your bodily existence through navigating the bureaucracy of the grant agencies. That's basically, you could say, that the dependence relationship. I used very micro level examples, but surely.
I wanted to, on that point, I don't want to interrupt you, Larry. Do you think even in the academic institution, or our institution, there is an academic celebrity class, that there are some academics that have the celebrity status who take a big piece of the pie? And we think about people, that make publications, and they're able to, make a significant impact, which may, often has an impact on disciplines too. But I wonder if that increasingly is a problem too, where there's an emphasis on an academic celebrity type, uh, and just one or two people, five people, and they get a lot of that recognition, right? And then overwhelmingly, I mean, you have a kind of exploited, not well compensated academic class that are struggling, you know, real struggling. And even so, even in the academic institution, there's a kind of consolidation of prestige and recognition, and you know who makes the tenure, stuff like that.
Yeah, so
It's it's probably a different topic, but
my
that's why I like
undergraduate,
Catherine Lewis. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, my undergraduate mentor, Randall Collins, wrote a book on the sociology of philosophies, and he retraced the lineage of a lot of philosophers throughout time, throughout history, and throughout geographic regions. And his big conclusion of his magnum opus is what is called the rule of 3 to 6, right? So it's the idea that you can only have 3 to 6 major thinkers that define the contours of the field. And definitely, so Collins' analysis is very much restricted to the intellectual sphere, the world of ideas, essentially, where you cannot have lots of people who have lots of ideas. That's why today in the sociology tradition, we call people Marxists, we call them Weberians, we call them Durkheimians for a reason, because there's only so few ideas that are traced back to big thinkers. But okay, so I think that's only one part of the answer. Obviously, I mean,
Multiple, yeah.
So it's not just intellectual field; it's also the institutional field. So I mean, if you look at the amount of money that goes into top universities, like Princeton, Yale, Stanford, etc., Harvard, versus the rest. I attended a job talk. I think this guy's name is Eaton. Last name, I forgot his first name, but he's researching the student loan fiasco in the country, but also the multiple tiers of the higher education system, essentially. And it's all driven by hedge funds and big financial investors who basically, so for the elite colleges, like, your Stanford, Harvard, Princeton's, they become major board members to manage the giant endowment. And the endowment, because of the whatever financial investments that they make, the endowment keeps growing by often double-digit percentages every year.
Wow.
And then with that money, they can then hire the star professors, as you mentioned, who have minimal teaching loads, high impact publications, and high level grants and whatever else. And then on the other hand, you have the well, in the middle you have the sort of public colleges that basically have less money. They rely more on tuition money to survive. But the worst off was sort of, like, you could say, at the bottom, which is the for-profit colleges. And these for-profit colleges are also taken over by these hedge funds. And these hedge funds have a guaranteed pool of money, which is the federal student loan programs.
Yeah.
So basically, any student that enrolls in these institutions and getting very questionable value when they graduate, and often end up with huge amounts of student debt, because the federal government is basically writing the checks to support the students.
Yeah, public financing. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's important that it doesn't happen in the grant basis. It happens on the student loan basis. And the latest thing that I've seen, I mean, the Biden administration, as you might recall, has suspended temporarily the student loan repayment during the pandemic crisis. There was a way to sort of not heap on the suffering of the student loan borrowers. And it turns out that the value of the student debt that effectively is written off by the federal government the past 2 years is about $110 billion.
Oh, wow.
Right. So the total debt amount, I think, is $1.4 trillion, and it keeps growing every year. But I mean, imagine if you didn't cancel the 110, I mean, it would be at 1.5 trillion already with the debt.
Oh, wow. Significant amount.
Yeah, I mean, but these huge amounts of money, they're possible because of the, well, you could say high interest rates, but then low rates of return, right? Because people are graduating with essentially worthless or close to worthless degrees, right?
That's a dilemma.
Yeah. So that, but the argument is, sociology 101. I mean, there's like a stratification that is happening in higher education, and it happens on the side of the students, the undergrads going through the program. But of course, as you mentioned, on the faculty side, it's exactly the same kind of phenomenon. Where, I mean, if you work at a level of junior and community colleges, there's not a whole lot of money that's coming in. I mean, an institution like at Princeton, I mean, we're funded by, there's donations, right? There's the tuition revenues, but
alumni, right? Alumni.
Yeah, sure. But then there's also the research funds that come from the federal government directly. I mean, to support the engineering program, to support the hard sciences, to support the humanities, and so on and so forth. And the name brand certainly is making a huge difference in how much money is coming through the door, for sure.
Yeah. Randall Collins called it credential society, right? Credential. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's what's happening broadly in our society. The latest trend that I've heard about anecdotally, not not supported by hard data that I've seen, but is the argument that credentials matter a little bit less, because in selected industries, the pandemic has created a labor shortage. Because the idea is that in the pandemic situation, you have people that are staying away from work, and then you don't have enough people coming back into the labor market. Older people, we have an aging society. Obviously, you have the baby boomers that are all pushing into the retirement cohort. And if there's insufficient amount of jobs, insufficient amount of workers, but more jobs, well, two things happen. I mean, you would usually see wages go up, and they have in some sectors, like warehousing. I mean, I think it was a very high wage increase recently. And then and another way you can find out about it is that the credential requirements would get lessened, right? Be easier to attain these jobs. But we'll have to see. I mean, I want to see the percent of job ads that require college degrees. Over time.
Yeah. I don't have anything else to add on that. I think you said it really well.
Yeah, I mean, credential inflation, I think, I mean, over the long term, I think the argument is correct, though, right? I think that, I mean, in the old days, I mean, when I say old days, I would say up until World War II, end of World War II, the whole idea of college was sort of, a social training academy for the ruling class, right? So yeah, so people who become political leaders, people who become business leaders, people who become the heads of NGOs, and so on and so forth, they tended to be trained socially within these let's say Ivy League institutions, or other top public colleges, and gradually we have expanded the role of credentials in society. And one of the main takeaways that I have from Randy Collins' work, the book was published in 1979, was so he used the label sinecure society, which is so a sinecure is a job that doesn't produce anything, but it is created as some kind of reward for the holder of that position. So I think in the old days, the way how the word sinecure was used was usually for veterans of wars, because war was the crucial function of a state. Prior to World War II, most of government spending was in the military back then, and a way to pay off the veterans for having fought successfully in the war, and to distribute the spoils to them would be by appointing them to sinecure positions. That is to say, civil service positions that don't have a tangible function.
Yeah.
And
Doesn't
yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but Du Bois, didn't he use that phrase psychological wages? That there's an economic wage that's paid out, but then there's this idea of a psychological wage. And I wonder if credentials have that effect of a non-economic. It could be used as a currency, but it's more of a psychological compensation wage, where credentials themselves give symbolic meaning. So I don't know if Randall Collins would agree with that. I would have to read more, but I get this impression that there's a greater emphasis on the symbolic meaning of credentials and putting it on the wall, and people see that as status, acquiring skill sets, just the whole process. I don't know if that's a psychological compensation rather than an economic kind of compensation that people receive when they get academic degrees. Because immediately you can't really turn it into cash, but you can over time, add it to your title, and you can add it to tell your friends. So I'm thinking more of a symbolic interaction is kind of.
Yeah, that's right. So another word to describe it is signaling, right? So you signal to potential employers that that you have the patience and the ability to learn quickly, new ideas, new concepts, and basically kind of soft skills that are being conveyed in college, then transferable to the actual work environment. But you don't really need to know anything that you have learned in college for the things that you do in your job. Right. The whole point is, so let's go back to the premise of Collins' argument, which is, so okay, why do we need to have a credential society? It's because of a mismatch in the labor market. Because so Collins' starting point is the same starting point that we had with the Precht conversation, which is the society of abundance, of economic abundance, rather than scarcity, which is the mainstream economic framing. So it's because of the abundance, the economic surplus production is extremely high. The level of automation is high and very much increasing. So basically, you then have a scarcity of nice positions. Nice positions means good jobs, stable jobs, benefits, etc. And I mean, imagine, the labor market is like the musical chair, right? And you have still the same amount of people that are, in the room, but you take away the number of chairs.
And you got scarcity.
Yeah, and then you let the music play, and then it stops, and then and then the question is, well, okay, what are the criteria by which I, as a person in the room, can claim access to a seat, to a scarce seat?
Credential.
Exactly, credentials. Right. I mean, it's just that I've got this badge in my pocket here, and all these other people in the room don't have the badge, and therefore I get to claim the seat. And you guys, good luck.
I agree with that framing of it. I was thinking another possible example, a rent-based argument, that credentials serve a form of rent seeking and rent extraction, that credentials enable to institutions to acquire rent, right? So you're right, it's just disequilibrium between supply and demand. And you can use the credential as a filtering mechanism, that you got to have this credential, otherwise you're not getting this job. But I think also the credentials themselves are forms of rents in the economic sense, that they can be used to extract rent and to implement rents. That you got to have like 3 different qualifications to be a nurse. So there's different levels: LVN, RN, and the same thing with plumbers, or even truck drivers. Truck drivers have to have a CDL. So there's a rent seeking mechanism that the state uses to require a license, and then a yearly physical, and so they charge, obviously. So I think it's a way to acquire rent, and usually both state institutions, but even private institutions are in the rent-seeking business. I think so. That's how I would interpret it. I think this disequilibrium problem of supply demand, and like you said, scarcity. It's so that the degrees become a way to filter out, or justified as a filter. But I also think that the degrees themselves are rent seeking kind of, or rent mechanisms. I believe, what's the guy's name? Soros, and he had a rent class-based theory.
I attended a talk by Kim Whedon from Cornell University, and
okay,
there was another person, Klein. He's an economist at Minnesota, and they were experts in occupational licensing. And I forgot all of the details of their argument, but the big argument is that occupational licensing is a form of rent seeking, is exactly what you just said.
It's just a theory. It's a theory that.
Well, it is true, though. I mean, because to the extent that, let's say, if you reduce the amount of requirements, let's take a concrete example of, let's say, taxi driving, where the barrier to its entry was quite steep because you had to take a test in order to qualify as a taxi driver, and to pass a test you had to memorize. Let's say if you're a taxi driver in New York City, you actually had to remember all of the roads and the alleyways in the city, and only if you remembered it fully can you pass the test. And basically, one piece of technology with 2 features basically destroyed it all, which is basically your cell phone, which contains a GPS and an app, right? And the app, of course, handles the payments and the searching for customers. And we call it Uber, we call it Lyft, right? And Uber has essentially destroyed the profession of the taxi drivers.
Yeah.
Because instead of having this high, barrier, this high requirement, you have individuals with a smartphone, internet access, and a private car who perform the same functions
Like
as a taxi driver without having to remember any of the roads and alleyways in the city, right? Right. So, and then what happens with the wages of the taxi drivers is, of course, it's it's going down. So anybody who has basically bought a medallion, like in the old-fashioned, yellow cap business, is basically losing out. There's, in fact, I mean, medallions are worth almost nothing nowadays. When before Uber, of course, they were very highly priced. So now, what's the right perspective on this? I mean, if I'm an Uber investor, or if I'm an Uber rider, or in some cases, if I'm an Uber driver, right, I would say the new innovation, the Uberization of the taxi business is good.
McDonaldization. Go ahead. Yeah, Uberization.
Right, because as an investor, I say, well, it's a new way for me to make money. As a customer, it's an easier way for me to acquire a cab ride, and it's cheaper maybe. And as a driver, it is a new employment opportunity, which used to be reserved for the professional taxi drivers.
I would go ahead. Continue. Let's go ahead. I have another entry. I would use the old Merton's view of ambivalence, that it has this double-edged sword. So with changes in the structure of the economy, there's not necessarily just good and bad, but unintended consequences. It can bring about change, so theoretically, I mean, we don't know precisely the end result, but Uberization definitely has consequences for the old taxi professions and whether they can ever recover. And so, yeah, that's the thing. I think there's unintended consequences that we can predict some of them, but some of them are harmful, for old professions.
Right. I think the New York Times said a story of, taxi driver suicides
have gone up.
Yeah, to December 23rd, 2019. Yeah, there was a case, driver suicide. He purchased a $750,000 medallion, and of course, that's now completely worthless because of Uber. And so it was highly disruptive. I mean, but if you take the tragic story of that, taxi driver committing suicide, compare it to the early 1800s with the Luddite movement, which was in the textile producing industry, where the textile automation essentially increased the production of textiles and thereby devalued the handicraft small manufacturers of clothing. And we are sort of, over time, I mean, we're seeing more and more examples of that kind of creative destruction, as Schumpeter calls it. And we're being told, well, this kind of adjustment is a necessary adjustment by the progress, you could say, advocates like mainstream economists and government politicians, business leaders and so forth. And so we, as the academics and the social activists, it's a big question in which camp we should belong to. Should we belong to the progress narrative, to the progress camp, or should we belong to the conservative Luddite faction?
Okay.
Or the third option is, the basic income faction. I mean, the sort of the redistribution and well, basically we're not against progress. We want the progress to happen. I mean, you just mentioned the dangerous and unhealthy jobs that are being cut out by automation. And it's a question why we want people to be working dangerous and unhealthy jobs, right?
Mm-hmm. No. And I think Brecht, this whole idea of Sinngesellschaft is what tries to break away from this fixation of labor employment, that there's a new autonomy. There's a new autonomy in the world of work that's possible with basic income. There is a way to disrupt this money coercion, forcing people into certain unwanted jobs, and basic income can bring about this autonomy and new kind of voluntary decisions that people are able to make, including truck drivers. I'm trying to think of the prospect of even truck drivers, let's say, had a basic income guarantee, and they wouldn't have to depend on 50 cents a mile, which today in the trucking industry is the norm. Truck drivers get paid per mile, and certain sectors could be more, be flexible, that more part-time work, less, excessive work requirement, and people sharing work responsibilities, maybe, not just, it's, I don't know if that's possible with basic income. I hope it is, but at least it would bring the pressure down in some sectors.
There's another, I think, aspect to basic income, which is that to the extent that we are subsidizing societally volunteer work, don't you think that the overall cost of living in society is going to come down? So just one example, let's say I have young children, and I have a neighbor who really likes children and really likes to spend time with them, play with them, teach them things, and so on and so forth. And imagine that that I wouldn't have to spend money on childcare, right? So the cost of living could actually come down while I maybe do other let's say volunteering services to to the community, while my neighbor's watching my kids, that sort of thing. So basically the idea being that actually by allowing the space for volunteering activities to increase, we are thereby lowering the cost of living. And that's, of course, a big factor to increase overall, psychological, mental, but also physical well-being, right? That, not concerned about high bills.
Yeah. I know another argument that's often made, that I also support, is that basic income could benefit the arts, culture, watching movies, creative things, that would enable a lot of people to do such leisure activities. And I was thinking about parks and recreation, how that could expand, even bicycling, that could open up a new industry of volunteer bicycle repairmen, or a new industry. I mean, if we think about the car industry, it is so entrenched in money that it requires so much money to keep the auto industry going. But if you had independent bicycle kind of shops that didn't solely do it on profit, but they had a large support base, that were bicycle enthusiasts, that you could really create an incentive that would expand the bicycle industry. I mean, the not just the e-bikes, but the entire sector, because a lot of the just think about the money that flows into like Tesla electric cars, and it's even Honda. I mean, the Toyotas. I mean, they're expensive. They're 30,000, 40,000 cars, but with basic income, I wonder then it would encourage alternative modes of transportation, and we see that in Europe. I mean, as far as the social benefit and people receiving social assistance from the state, like in Denmark and in Germany, obviously those people cannot afford cars, so they often are, they moved onto the public transportation system. They are encouraged to seek alternative modes of transportation, including bicycles. So I wonder if that, with basic income, it would open up that possibility, and hopefully cities would invest more. Here where I live, there is actually a positive movement. I'm really starting to see more bike lanes being introduced. People are, thinking more proactive of encouraging different modes of transportation, and I think it could be an investment. It could be like, think about it. I mean, it's friendly, environmentally friendly. It would reduce the flow of traffic, and maybe people get healthier. I don't know. Maybe there's some more mobility, and with cars, it seems everybody gets fat. I don't know.
Yeah, there's definitely a positive correlation
Yeah,
between, say, people that are biking to work and cardiovascular health, for instance, or
yeah,
incidence of obesity. All of these things,
yeah.
of course, are closely interconnected. I mean,
Mm.
so one of my, I mean, I go 2 or 3 times a week bicycling, but also I
Oh,
go
that's good.
hiking once a week in the woods, um and there's always something very calming about being outside. Now obviously there's always the cautious voice of people that I hear were like, oh well, you should be careful going outside because you have ticks
Yeah,
everywhere and you're going to
yeah.
get Lyme disease or whatever. I don't know, but assuming that the most negative things don't happen, no, there's something very calming about just like listening to the chirping birds, listening to the wind going against the leaves in the tree, and the calmness of it, the fresh air, of course, because you're a little bit further
Oh,
away
yeah.
from like buildings and car traffic and stuff. And yeah, and I mean, why is that working so effectively psychologically?
Mhm.
I think it is because that's where we come from. I mean, we're hunters and gatherers, right? I mean, I think
Oh,
that
yeah. It's
uh,
species being, it's our instincts. It
yeah,
goes back to close to
and
nature, right?
and we sort of because we sit in front of computers now. I mean, we have this mistaken impression that simply because we spend so much time in front of the screen that this is the natural thing, that this is what we should always be doing, and
Yeah.
it's not. But then there's like this economic disconnect logic, right, where we say, well, because you're a teacher, so you have to prepare your slides on the screen. I'm a researcher, so I have to prepare my text on the Word document and the screen, right? um and then if we are spending too much time bicycling and walking and hiking in the woods,
Not
we're not productive.
productive.
We are wasting our lives, according to the Puritans, right?
Yeah.
And this is of course a disastrous vision. But
Yeah. That's
anyway,
good. Yeah. Yeah.
okay, let's turn to the
Switch
geopolitics now.
geopolitics.
This
Uh-oh.
hugely important
Oh, hopefully. Go
topic.
ahead.
So yeah, so do you have an evaluation, I mean, about what's happening in the front line? I mean, in this Ukraine Russia war. Obviously, we had discussed this when I was down in Texas
Oh yeah.
back then. But I know, do you have sort of a take on what's happening most recently?
I honestly am following all the different news broadcasts like you are. So uh, I just plug into the news. I do have somewhat of a geopolitical understanding, and I look at all the actors that are involved and the superpowers and there are different scenarios, different narratives, different entry points that we can go into when it comes to the war in Ukraine and Russia and the EU and NATO and all the other actors that are also, operating behind the scenes. But I guess I have one entry point. Maybe I can use my political science background. This is less than a sociological kind of background. Although I have a sociological way of looking at this conflict, war. Through the lens of framing and frame analysis. But if I'm a political scientist, let's say, those were my old days. I remember some of my mentors some of who researched in the area of Eastern European politics, one of which passed several years ago, my professor Milan Riban, who that was his life, his career. He focused just on Eastern Europe. Others that over the years that I remember some of their works that actually are still relative to topics that they addressed. I can mention some of their names. Stephen Saxenberg, who wrote his dissertation at Uppsala University, The Fall of Communism in Four Countries. Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and I think another country, I can't remember. But anyways, where do these topics go, and how can we use some of these discussions? It's the question of transition and non-transition from totalitarianism, all right? And when I look at Russia, whether we are talking about a declining superpower that's desperate to regain its superpower status, I'm always confronted with the question whether, when we look at, for instance, Russia and Putin, that we never really saw a transition away from totalitarianism, nor towards post-totalitarianism. But a lot of people were enthusiastic.
You mean democratization specifically?
Yeah. So I kind of have this idea that we were too optimistic in the West, and we thought that Russia would just sort of democratize on its own, and there would be a post-totalitarian kind of system. And to some extent, with the fall of '89, a lot of people thought, oh, Russia is in transition, but now this idea that I'm stuck with is this non-transition, that it never really transitioned. And that's what we see. We see a very violent kind of military oriented philosophy with Putin, and you see this revival of autocratic statism, if you like, suppressing dissidents and engaging, to some extent with NATO. But I think that's that non-transition. I think when you look at Russia, for instance, as a non-transition away from totalitarianism, and we never really got to a post-totalitarian system or regime, right? And there's still other countries that people sometimes look at. Maybe people look at North Korea, or they look at Cuba, or they say, oh, it's an autocratic system. But with Russia and Putin, I think, yeah, we have this autocratic style of government and a declining superpower that wants to be a superpower again, and through the imagery and force of its military force. I think that's what's the attempt. I think the attempt is to try to reconstruct a Russian empire or some kind of a Russian superpower that goes back 100 years, and Ukraine is in a trap because it's stuck in this. I guess it's the victim in this case. It was maybe Poland before and other European right countries that were swallowed up during World War II. But in this case, it's Ukraine now, right? Ukraine. So that's my take. My take is it's the transition away from totalitarianism never took place, and we definitely don't see a post-totalitarian system in Russia. We still see a totalitarian kind of system.
Well, it's interesting. I
Yeah.
mean, in your framing, I mean, that there's
Yeah.
a direct link between authoritarianism and imperialism, right?
Okay.
It is not an automatic link, because if you compare to, other authoritarian cases, as you mentioned, in Venezuela, or in Iraq during Saddam Hussein, or in Afghanistan, and all these places where you have very clearly authoritarian structures of state power, but they're not combined with imperialism. And
Okay.
it seems to be that this is something that is peculiar to authoritarian countries that have had an imperial past. And I was currently just finished reading a book. It's an edited volume by Gregory Fries.
Oh wow.
And it's just a broad history of Russia.
Yeah.
Russia history, and because all I wanted to have is collect the facts. I mean, like what happened in the Russian history, and it starts with the Kievan Rus in the 9th century, and which where Kiev was the origin of, you could say, the Slavic nation state. And Moscow was established several hundred years later. I forgot which year, but a little bit later than Kiev. And so, and what's very weird is that Vladimir Putin, you recall, he wrote this essay in the summer of last year when he was using his distorted reading of history to justify the invasion war against Ukraine, to basically say that the national fate of Ukraine and Russia are tied together, that they cannot be separated based on the historically common roots that the two nations have. But we know that this is a very distorted and weird vision of history, because,
right.
I mean, imagine if a German politician today was to use the historical grievances and historical claims to territory in order to justify foreign and military aggression. I mean, if you consider the origins of Prussia, which was the leading state of the German Empire, when it brought the German domains together in 1871, they hailed from Königsberg, which is today called Kaliningrad. So it's part of Russia. But back then, the rulers of Prussia usually came from that region in the Baltic Sea. But surely, you're not going to have any German politicians today that's using historical references to justify retaking Kaliningrad, or Poland for that matter, right? So it's a very weird vision that Mr. Putin has. But okay, so but these are the reasons that he's that's a pretext, right? So he's pushing forward historical grievances to justify the invasion. I think we need to have a slightly different angle
Mhm.
to analyze why he actually decided to use these historical grievances. Um, I'm quite convinced at this point that in the history of Putin's rule, the last 23 years, he has recognized that whenever his internal poll ratings are down in the country,
He's got to do something.
yeah, because of a declining
Yeah.
economy, economic crisis, whatever the sanctions policies in the last 8 years, he sort of, whenever he waged a war, the poll ratings went up again. I mean, that's very common. I mean, if you remember, after 9/11, when George W. Bush had 90% approval rating, which is completely unheard of, and he was using that height of popularity to start the Afghanistan and the Iraq war, right? I mean, imagine if Joe Biden today was sort of getting up saying, hey, there's the next Middle East country I want to invade. I don't think he would
He
get the
would be
same kind of support.
criticized. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So I guess what you're getting at is this synthetic hyper nationalism that Putin uses to get people to not look at domestic internal problems. And if he can focus on the war in Ukraine, he can set a nationalistic or revive nationalism, revive Russian nationalism as a kind of ideological tool to hide internal problems in Russia. And as long as people think about Ukrainian war, or they don't call it war, I guess conflict, and they're focused on war, then the idea is that Putin can consolidate his power. He can figure out who his descendants are and make use of the war for his own gain, his own political legitimacy too.
Yes, under one
That
condition.
on the
The
one condition,
condition is that he wins the war.
right?
So it's important, the fact that he doesn't want to call it a war. You know, he suppresses the media coverage over it. He
Mhm.
calls it a special military operation. And that's because he knows that the official reason, so the not the official reason, the actual reason for fighting the war, he cannot say, right? Which is, you know, basically he wants to recreate the Soviet Union and he wants to
Yeah.
kill Ukrainians to realize that vision.
Mhm.
And of course, I mean, if you stated the real reason for fighting the war, the Russians are not going to support it,
Yeah.
because the Russians and Ukrainian people are very close, right?
Larry, when you look at Putin's behavior now, does he strike you as a kind of classic Machiavellian? I mean, he's sort of this old KGB past that he had. And the reason why I use Machiavellian or Machiavelli as a entry point, this deceptive character, this uh, going after descendants, and obviously very cautiously, openly using military force and power. That is a classic kind of Machiavellian character. So I wonder, again, I'm not trying to uh, use this concept loosely, but when I think of Machiavellian, it's this ruthlessness, this nothing matters, and it's just a power game. It's a power play for him, and regime survival. Even Chomsky had this book he wrote, Hegemony or Survival. And I'm thinking in the case of Russia, it's either war or hegemony. There's or it's survival. It's maybe the country is on the brink, and Putin knows this, and he may think that his legacy will not last forever. He's getting older, and internal dynamics might shift Russian society. We don't know. I know there's a lot of internal tensions, particularly younger generation. So there's a lot of things going on within Russia that we barely know because it's just cut off right now, right? But I wonder if he's using this also internally to switch gears and to just kind of consolidate power within his country and then just focus on war making in Ukraine instead.
Well, it's an
Yeah,
important question whether he's
yeah,
Machiavellian. I would say that
yeah. Okay.
I would say that up until he decided on the full-scale invasion, I think, there might be a good case for that to be made, because
Yeah,
there's another thing that I haven't mentioned yet,
yeah,
which is that the prior military engagements that Putin has chosen were always successful. This is very important to state that, right? So, if you recall that the first war was a war in Chechnya, there was a first war in Chechnya and the Boris Yeltsin in the 90s, 1994-5, which the Russians lost. And the second Chechnya war around the year 99, 2000, where, the city of Grozny was completely razed to the ground. And all of the so-called terrorists, the ones that were fighting against Russia, were basically killed. And of course, a huge swath of the civilian population was killed as well. And he then put in charge, you could say, a loyalist puppet, Ramzan Kadyrov, and who is known for all sorts of human rights violations and killing journalists and critics, etc. So that was a success. 2008, when he was backing South Ossetia and Abkhazia province, which were two provinces in Georgia that were fighting for their independence, and Putin sent the army in and crushed the much smaller Georgian army, and the West condemned it verbally, but didn't really do anything about it.
yeah.
And then 2014 Crimea, with the little green men, they come in and take over Crimea, and there was not a single shot fired because the Ukrainian armed forces were in complete disarray at that point. And then there was the first round of sanctions, but the sanctions were not very severe. I mean, they led to a brief recession in Russia, but it wasn't that deep. And Germany, a year later, signed the very famous Nord Stream 2 pipeline agreement, which doubled the potential gas supply from Russia to Germany. And then 2015, the Syria intervention, when Assad was about to be toppled by the anti-regime rebels, and the Russian armed forces backed up Assad and successfully beat back the insurgents. And in each of these military endeavors, it was Russian success at a relatively low cost to the country, both in military and financial terms. And the unwillingness of the Western countries, in particular Germany, because Germany is the leading power in Europe, which ultimately resulted in greater ambitions of a military aggressive nature. And we're dealing with those consequences today.
You mean like a snowball effect, that it even encouraged Russia to continue, and you mean a snowball effect, that it provided a momentum for military-based action? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, it's about whetting the appetite of the bear, and sort of allowing Russia to sort of get away with it, with really imperial ambitions. And the Germans haven't sort of fully understood it. And it's the Germans and the French together, I mean, it has to be said.
Yeah.
Because so in German history, as you remember, in I would say, was it 1972 or something, where Willy Brandt,
Ostpolitik. Yeah.
yeah, he started the Ostpolitik, and Wandel durch Handel is the mantra, right? So the idea is it's old-fashioned modernization theory, right? The idea is if you increase trade with a country, then there's going to be economic exchange, prosperity, there's going to be cultural, political, social exchange. People learn from each other, people understand each other, and then they cannot fight a war with each other. And they've had it since 1972. And I understand at that point why they would do that, right? Because if you remember at the beginning of the Cold War, when the Americans conducted the Berlin airlift, right, when Stalin was closing the border of West Berlin to the east and the rest of East Germany, it was such a moment of high tension between West and East in this inner German conflict, West and East. And the West Germans' perspective was that they had to engage with the Soviet Union because they would be the ones who have to pay dearly in terms of human life if the Soviets started World War III, right? So I think they had a much greater stake in preventing armed conflict with the Soviet Union.
Definitely. Yeah.
And then then the Berlin Wall fell. So you had the post-Cold War era in the 1990s. And you had the first social democratic chancellor in a long time, Gerhard Schröder. And he brought in the red-green government in 1998. And they began the talk of denuclearization, right? The idea of shutting down the nuclear power plants in Germany, and then transition to, basically green energy, renewable alternative energy, and so forth. But then they said, well, okay, if we want to do that without nuclear, we need a bridge technology. And the bridge technology was gas, Russian gas.
Oops. Yeah.
So that's when Nord Stream 1 was built in the 90s, I believe. And then in the 2010s, you had the Nord Stream 2, which was never operational, by the way, because now the Ukraine war started. And of course, dashed the energy plans of the current German government.
Definitely a miscalculation of energy policy,
Right.
That's what I would argue.
Yeah, because the Germans, I think they had this mistaken idea that energy policy and security policy were separate subjects. Right. I mean, so the fact that they were not computing the fact that the Crimea and Donbass invasion was not, separable from the gas pipeline. You couldn't possibly separate it because because of once the war happens, what you're funding the war efforts of the Kremlin. I mean, I think it was the EU foreign commissioner said that 30 billion euros goes to the Kremlin war budget from energy purchases, while 1 billion euros goes to fund weapons to Ukraine. I mean, you could already see the discrepancy
Yeah, yeah.
right there with these numbers.
Major miscalculation. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, right. So, and then the questions you would give, well, what's the way out of it? I mean, we saw the German energy minister Robert Habeck from the Greens, who
In the Middle East, right? He's trying
yeah,
to
he
look.
traveled to Qatar and he signed new gas deals.
Mhm.
And there was this very interesting. So of course, there's always a press entourage that comes with him. And the German journalist asked him, "Don't you think that there are certain human rights concerns that we have in Qatar?" Which of course there are plenty. It's a Middle East country, right?
Yeah.
And he says, um, well, we weren't expecting them to have a stellar human rights record. We need the gas right now, and
We're going to overlook that one for now.
yeah. See, look, there's a valuation calculation on the German side where they're saying that yes, we're funding the conflicts in the Middle East inevitably. There's also remember that with the Iran nuclear deal that the Biden administration agreed to get back on, the Iranians as an oil supplier of the global economy sort of put back online, and of course we know that they're funding terrorist organizations in other parts of the Middle East, and so do the Saudis, and so does the UAE, and so does Qatar, and so forth, right? So um, the Middle East conflicts are going to continue. They're going to intensify. It's going to result in refugee crisis, etc. But it's a calculated risk from the European perspective because they feel that.
No other options.
Well, they feel that the Ukrainian crisis is much closer to home than whatever the civil war in Yemen, right?
Yeah.
Which is also tragic. I mean, there's like thousands of people dying over there, right? But it's not as close to home. I mean, nobody in Europe has said that Yemen is going to join the European Union anytime soon. While, of course, the same discussions are in fact happening with Ukraine today. Right. I mean, and there's this argument. Well, okay, are you saying that white lives matter more than brown lives? Yeah, I think that's what the Europeans are saying, and I understand, why they would do that, right? I mean, the Ukraine conflict is so much closer to home. It's
a Eurocentric geographic issue, right? Geopolitical, it's closer. So you think that they see it as a serious potential issue because it could easily go into Poland, and it
well,
could
it has
affect,
already. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, with
the
a
3 million
movement of
refugees. Yeah.
flow. So yeah, I understand what you're saying, that it's definitely very Eurocentric because the fact that Ukrainian conflict is so close to Germany and Poland, right next door, so yeah, I could see it taking a priority for EU. Yeah, it's actually strikingly very similar to Chernobyl accident when it happened. This acknowledgement that things are so close, and that disaster, that affected at that time radiation levels where the clouds went to Scandinavia all the way to Germany. I have the same feeling. This is not, Chernobyl accident, but this is a war in the same region where we had the nuclear disaster happen. So it's proximity. I think it's a proximity issue.
Right, and
Scale.
it's also interesting. I mean, this Chernobyl legacy has an impact on
Oh yeah,
contemporary views about the viability of you know the use of nuclear energy.
Yeah.
Because I know the debates in Austria, for instance, in 1978, there was a discussion to implant the first nuclear power plant in Zwentendorf, and it was the project was cancelled. It was planned by the government, and they held a referendum after some public pressure, in which a majority of the voters turned down the proposal. And ever since then, the Austrian government has put itself as at the forefront to lobby inside the European Union to stop supporting nuclear energy as a source of green energy, and which is very controversial, because if you look at France, which is very, very reliant on nuclear power, actually reversed course recently and increased the amounts of nuclear power plants that they plan to build in the near future. But it's very, very interesting, because if you look at the Austrian level of discourse, where along with Germany and Hungary, they are the major European countries that are blocking the energy sanctions against Russia.
Oh, wow.
Because 80% of the Austrian gas is derived from Russia. And that is a level, I mean, it's 40% in Germany. Now, mind you, I mean, Germany is 10 times bigger as an economy. So the Germans, of course, still suck much more gas out of Russia than Austria. But relatively speaking, Austria is much more dependent on the Russian gas.
You think that has something to do with its legacy of neutrality, that it never joined NATO, and the fact that it during World War II, it had to claim neutrality. I think that was the deal for the Russian troops to leave, if I recall correctly. The neutrality position of Austria, its history and legacy of not siding of NATO and staying neutral, and that's how I understood Austrian.
Right. So,
did I get it right?
Yeah. So this is a big piece of the story. So in 1945, as you recall, I mean, there was a four-way partitioning of Austria in the same way as Germany, between the three Western Allied powers and then the Soviet Union. And one of the first, so the Soviet occupation zone, which was in the northeast of Austria, one of the first things the Soviets did was they wanted to get access to the oil refineries of the occupied regions. And at that point, there were three political parties: so the OVP, the SPO, and the KPO. So it's the communist, the socialist, and the conservative. And the first government, they were all together, and then the government of national unity. And then shortly after that, they expelled the Communist Party because the communists were basically too close to Moscow. So they didn't want that. And so then the next thing that they did was they nationalized the oil refineries. So the idea was to basically prevent the Soviets from plundering those assets. But nonetheless, there were other companies that the Soviets tried to incorporate into their own empire. That is to say, basically plunder. I mean, which is what you see in Bucha and those places in Ukraine, where the Russian soldiers, steal whatever TV and computer and whatever that they can find in Ukraine. And the Soviets clearly tried to do the same after World War II. And so there was a huge consensus that developed in the Austrian political system among the two big parties, SPO, OVP, to declare neutrality with the proviso that not only the West, the NATO troops would leave Austria, but also the Soviet troops. And so, okay, and there's another important historical event that I should mention. In 1961 and 1979, there was a high-level meeting between the Soviet leaders and the American leader, so Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy in 61, and then in 79 between Jimmy Carter and Leonid Brezhnev. And those two meetings among the US-Soviet leaders happened in Vienna because Austria was the neutral country. It would be neither affiliated with the West nor with the East. But of course, this was all a diplomatic show because, as you might know, the Iron Curtain still proceeded over the eastern border of Austria and not on the western side. Because if you look at the economic history of Austria, it was very deeply integrated with the German economy.
Oh, yeah.
If you look at, I mean, most of the cars that are driven, like Volkswagen and Porsche and Audi and so forth, they have car parts that are made in Austria, actually. And also, to some extent with the Italian economy, also next door. So, so that meant, so politically and economically, Austria remained a united country. So it was not divided like Germany. And it was a Western country. That's important. And so then the perspective that it took towards the Soviet Union and towards Russia, I believe, is very, very inviting. It's very similar to the Ostpolitik in Germany.
Okay.
And I mean, so within the European Union, I mean, or within Europe broadly, I mean, you see the division very clearly. That most of the former Soviet states, that is to say, post-Soviet states and former Warsaw Pact states, like Poland and Romania, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states, they are all staunchly anti-Russian and pro-Ukrainian. The same thing with the United Kingdom, which the United Kingdom sees itself more as a transatlantic rather than a European power, as we saw with Brexit. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so the transatlantic countries is the UK, and then the post Warsaw Pact states are all staunchly anti-Russian. And I mean, you can see that with the level of financial aid that is supplied to Ukraine, the military aid, the demand for complete sanctioning. The Baltic states are also very reliant on Russian gas, but they decided to cut it off, which the Austrians and the Germans have not done. And I understand, because the Austrians and the Germans, they don't think that they will ever be invaded by Russia. I mean, even in the most optimistic scenario of optimistic from the Russian side of view, they don't feel like they are threatened militarily in the same way as the Baltic states or Poland, for instance. So that's internal conflict, and that's what actually the strong point that Putin was banking on, to divide the Western countries in their commitment towards Ukraine. And
it backfired on him, right? Somewhat. You think it backfired on him? No.
Yes, it has.
Okay.
So the level of sanctions that were being imposed on Russia are extraordinarily severe. I mean, to the extent, so the two key components is about cutting off the access to the central bank reserves, to which the Russians don't have access to anymore. And then the second is the technology blocking. So there's reports now where the Russian military companies can no longer produce military hardware like tanks and missiles, etc. Because a lot of the those exports rely on technology components that are drawn from the West. So I think that if there had been a proper cost benefit analysis on the Kremlin side, I don't think the invasion would have happened. But now that it happened, it will be prosecuted to the very end. Because at this point, the military failure on the Russian side is going to result in
collapse of Russia, maybe?
Of the collapse of the Russian government in particular. Okay. Because right now, the Kremlin is forced, more or less, to tell its people that they have to suffer the economic deprivation, the high inflation, and the blockage of Western imports, etc., temporarily, in order to gain access to Ukrainian territory, effectively. If the Russian military gets defeated, however, they basically get nothing. So in that case, the Russian military is going to be destroyed, and they will not have any territory, and they will suffer from the economic hardship from the sanctions. Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's any way how Putin can pull his head out of it in any way, unless he can show some military success in the battlefront.
Agreed, fully.
Yeah. The important opening, that is to say, uncertainty that we have at the moment, is to what extent are the Western countries committed to provide the financial and military support to Ukraine to sustain the battle. Because in terms of just the sheer willingness to battle and fight, I mean, look at what's happening in Mariupol, the city in Donbass that is basically completely ravaged.
Yeah, I saw that in the news.
Yeah, there's like this steel factory which is called Azovstal, which is the only piece of Mariupol that is held by the Ukrainian side. And there's such a high, I mean, what is it about? It's a high battle morale. I mean, the Ukrainians, they're willing to die for it. They're willing to die for the cause. And they will fight this to the end. And I don't know, I have a feeling that, like, if the military support from NATO and the West is insufficient, that the Ukrainians still have a slim chance of winning, but it's going to be an extremely long war.
Oh, yeah.
And they're going to be losing so many more people. So really, I think if the West is able to supply the ammunition to essentially destroy the Russian army, that would bring the war to an end. And at the moment, I see only the US is actually able to provide this level of technology. I mean, in terms of the drones, the artillery pieces, the aircraft, the anti-ship missiles, the tanks, and all these other things. Only the US as a superpower, I think, would have the wherewithal to basically go all the way to tilt the military balance in favor of Ukraine.
I could see a covert military U.S. military involvement, which probably already is being done. But as far as reversing a political decision at that moment and to engage U.S. military troops, that would be seen as a risk that U.S. would get involved in another war. But I think of covert. I can think of a covert military support that's something like in the nature of the Cold War, secretive, it's not a public, it's not for debate. And I'm sure that's already happening now, but I don't think a U.S. involvement of openly involving and sending ships or airplanes with U.S. symbols, I wouldn't see that as.
I'm against the U.S. soldiers fighting.
Right.
I think that's very
But
different.
you mean hardware? You mean U.S. military hardware?
Hardware, exactly. It's about the supply of hardware in particular. Though I saw an interview yesterday with Chris Coons, the U.S. senator from Connecticut, and he was actually supporting. Well, the way how he phrased it was that eventually there would need to be U.S. boots on the ground. So that to me is very, very worrying. I mean, to sort of put that possibility out there, but then at the same time, so in terms of communication, an element of surprise, I think, is important. An element of uncalculability, so to speak, unpredictability, because when Joe Biden says, we don't want NATO troops on the ground, when Putin hears that, I mean, he feels like a reassurance, right? It's like, okay, so he's giving me the green light to invade, essentially. While I think now I would say, I mean, back when Biden said it a couple of weeks ago, I agreed with him. But now, actually, I take the view that even though your action is still going to be no involvement of NATO, right? But I think your communication, should be unpredictable, right? That is to say, we might step in, right?
If the red line has been crossed, right? So how it works. The red line has been crossed.
Well, okay, with the red lines, you have to be careful too, because if you set up the red lines, then you actually have to enforce it, right? So it might be better to be unpredictable. So let's say if the journalist asks the White House official, do you exclude NATO involvement? You purposefully leave the answer ambiguous. I mean, even though like your real answer is yes, we don't want any NATO involvement, but your communication that goes to the world, but also to the Kremlin, is we're going to leave it open.
Yeah,
we're going to leave it open.
Yeah, we're going to leave it open.
Right, because you don't. So right now the concern is we don't want to give the green light to the Kremlin to increase the aggression, right?
And butcher,
yeah. I mean, it's like, I mean, the Ukrainians, I mean, if they look at the pictures in Bucha and in Borodyanka and these places that were liberated by the Ukrainians, I don't see any other way. I mean, they're going to fight this to the end, because what they're saying essentially, and it makes total sense, is that if they surrendered now, the Russians could massacre even more people.
Yeah.
And they certainly will, because, like, remember Randy Collins has his book on violence, and he talks about
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
this concept of forward panic. Forward panic is the idea that when soldiers are fighting in the battlefront, they are completely stressed for weeks and weeks on end, right? They face like explosions and mortar grenades, explosions and bombs and everything. And then when there's like when the battle is kind of over, or there's like a lull in the battle, then all of a sudden they start, go to civilian population, they rape the women and the girls, they slaughter and they kill the men.
Mhm.
Because because the bodies are still pumped with the adrenaline of the war.
Yeah.
It was like,
So
oh my God, these people have dared to kill me, and I'm so, it's like basically your amygdala is going crazy.
social psychological
Yeah,
reaction.
exactly.
Okay.
And then you start lashing out. I mean, especially against the defenseless, right? Because I mean, with a soldier, the soldier has a gun in his hand, right? But the civilian population, oh my God, look at this, um, you know, woman or man, um, and so this is the forward panic. That's a psychological reaction
Yeah. It makes
in the
sense. What you
war.
said. Yeah.
Yeah, and so therefore, I think that, I mean, that's always one of the problems, right? Where the leaders, when they say start the war, it's so easy to do it. But then when you say, well, let's have a halt in the campaign to allow for humanitarian evacuations, and the soldiers don't listen, because the soldiers are like, oh, look, this guy was firing at me, so I'm going to fire back.
Retaliation. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Feelings of
So
portrayal of the. Yeah. Yeah. I know what you're talking about.
right. So it's easy to start the war. It's very hard to stop it.
You.
Um,
I'm not trying to interrupt you. You ever thought about Ardono's concept of this authoritarian personality manifestation in military action and this brutality, sadistic almost, and killing of civilians reminds us of the this authoritarian personality type that Adorno talked about. That certain traits that often people have. And I wonder, you think about the Russian military and this socialization, very young males sent into warfare, often confuse themselves about the objective of war. I think I read something that even some of the Russian soldiers, they themselves didn't really know where they were going. They were not, it wasn't communicated with them or something that yeah, so there's a lot of confusion. I can see that war creates confusion and there's lots of emotions, but this, I remember this concept that Ardono used, this authoritarian personality. Or what was the gender theorist Raymond Connell, hegemonic masculinity, the idea, it's like a gender concept. I could see it being used in this, at least the images that we see of the brutality and the use of rape as a war tool, and this slaughter of civilians, really memories of World War II, like real brutal memories, just destruction of cities, and uh, so yeah. So I don't
well,
know
so the
this.
authoritarian personality, I think, is
Yeah. How would
quite.
that be like Putin, right? Putin would be a
Yeah,
character
well,
flaw, character
yes,
trait.
yes. And there's an important piece of
Yeah.
military strategy which is important in this context, which is that why did the Ukrainians win the Battle of Kiev? Why were the Russians defeated in the Northern Front and had to retreat back to the state border? And so part of it has to do with the terrain, right? Where, it was easy for the Ukrainian soldiers to hide and wait in ambush and then, basically ambush the superior Russian forces. The extended supply lines, which the Russians were completely neglecting because they just sent the tanks forward without securing the supply lines first. But there's another piece that is connected with this authoritarianism. Do you know that there's 8 generals who were assassinated by the Ukrainians?
Yeah, I remember reading about
the Russian generals. And the reason why that's been happening is because there is no initiative on the side of the lower level soldiers, specifically at the level of the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers. Those were the leaders of like battalions and companies. These are like smaller military units that are operating on the ground. And so the Kremlin was sending in their high-level generals to basically direct the actual battlefront, and that's where they're vulnerable to get killed by assassins. And while it seems to be that the Ukrainian army was structured like the Soviet and Russian army until the year 2014. And then in the year 2014, with the Donbass invasion by the Russians, the Americans and the Western countries, so the Canadians, the British, the Lithuanians, and the Polish, created a military training facility run by NATO in west of Ukraine, and they were training the Ukrainian NCO, the non-commissioned officers, the ones that would lead the battalions and the companies. And they were instructing the Ukrainian NCOs to take initiative, individual initiative, flexible adaptation to the battlefield conditions, and not wait for the orders from the top level generals. And this level of strategic tactical flexibility and individualism, which is the opposite of authoritarianism.
A flattened hierarchy, kind of very flat.
Yes, this allowed the Ukrainians the tactical flexibility to conduct the military operations and to attack the Russian forces in ambushes.
Okay. Makes sense.
And that's that. I mean, and then of course there's the Western weapons, obviously, right? The Javelin missiles and the Starstreak and all these other things. But yeah, so the authoritarianism versus individualism is, in this case, the individualism side. In the military was one of the crucial factors for the battle success of the Ukrainian side. And the inaptitude, the inflexibility of the Russian strategy, where the Russians, they were just, they have this one central playbook, right, which is start with airstrikes and artillery strikes, and once the strikes are over, then you send in the tanks, and then you just attack. And of course, and then what if the Ukrainians are waiting in ambush, right? There's no response. There's no adaptation on the Russian side, because if the column gets destroyed, right, and they just wait for tomorrow, and then they send another
Hmm.
another group of cannon fodder to attack the Ukrainian lines. So I think this is a big difference, and it. I mean, this is how David is able to beat Goliath.
Oh yeah, use that metaphor. That's pretty good.
Right, because I mean, if you look before the war started, right? If you just look at the score sheet, right, and you see, whatever the Russians have 12,000 tanks and the Ukrainians have 2,000. The Russians have 600 attack helicopters and the Ukrainians have 50 or something like that, right? So those raw numbers, they give you the impression that, well, the Ukrainians can be mowed over, and that's what Putin believed too, right?
Underestimation, yeah.
Yeah, if he didn't believe it, I don't think he would have ordered the invasion, right?
Yeah. Miscalculation for him, yeah.
Yeah, and ultimately, so what can we say ultimately about the Ukraine situation? So I'm going to make this very wild prediction.
Yeah, make one.
Which is, I think that the Ukrainians are going to win this war. And I think the Russians will have to withdraw whatever troops that they have left
within a year.
Yeah, it will culminate in a few months, I would say.
Oh wow!
But there's a possibility, obviously, that if Putin decides to throw off the cloak of the military operation with bullshit, right, and he says we're going to do full mobilization to fight the war, right? What that means is basically call up the reserves. It's about 2 million men. Call up all of the conscripts. It's about 130,000. Put them in a uniform and send them to the front. Then I think maybe the Ukrainian forces could be mowed down at the end of it. But in any case, it would be such a Pyrrhic victory. I mean, I think the Russians are going to lose regardless because of the extent of the sanctions that are imposed against it.
Makes sense.
That's going to degrade their economy over the long term. And so why am I optimistic on the Ukrainian side? Well, I argue that there's an asymmetry in the war, of what I call David versus Goliath. It's not Putin versus Zelensky. It's not Ukrainian people versus Russian people. I think the war is between Putin and the Ukrainian people.
Okay.
Because the Russian people don't really want to fight the war. Because why else do you have to tell them the lie about the military operation instead of calling it a war? And then Zelensky, while he was being celebrated, obviously, for not fleeing the capital at the beginning of the war, and there's a lot of kudos that has to go to him, but then, but recall also, I mean, this guy was a comedian. He was voted in by 73% of the population in the presidential election. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that
he was well liked. Yeah.
Yeah, he's well liked, and not only that, I think also he has a good sense of where the Ukrainian people stand on the issue of preserving nationhood and sovereignty. And he was channeling the Ukrainian people. I mean, I don't think that because I mean, if he was just simply standing there in Kiev and saying, please fight the war, and if the Ukrainians didn't want to fight, I mean, look at what happened in Afghanistan, right? the Afghan government and the Ashraf Ghani was toppled very quickly, right? Even if the leader says, fight the war, and the soldiers don't listen, right? And the Taliban takes over. But that wasn't the situation in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine, the leader goes up, and he was not commanding his people. He was channeling his people, right? He was reflecting the will of the people ultimately to fight. And
let's call it, I'm sorry to interrupt, charismatic mobilization. I mean, it's just a style of Zelensky, of charismatic leadership style, of embodiment of hope and of the nation. Yeah. So in the Kaufman tradition, he's a if we use a dramaturgical analysis, he's a leader, image of a leader, and so agency. I see this element of agency. Whereas if you think of Putin, he messed it up. I think it's synthetic image, and to what extent, I don't know. Putin still has support in Russia. I assume he still has supporters like you would expect, but with how he plays it out, I don't know. Comparing, contrasting these two different leaders and their style, to what extent it affects the war outcome. We don't know. On the one hand, you have this display of leadership that's necessary and useful to produce legitimacy in the eyes of the population, right? And Zelensky, I mean, he went to different parliaments live, and he like gave a speech, the German Bundestag, the British House of Commons, the US Congress or Senate, I think. So he's very creative there. I think he's very displaying this charismatic leadership and utilizing it too. It was like a charismatic mobilization. So I think he goes to the front, and then he takes pictures of him wearing a helmet. Right? You've seen the images, I'm sure.
Yeah. So dramaturgy is not far-fetched because he's a comedian, right? That's his trade.
Yeah. I was thinking like Kaufman. I was thinking, oh, this could be useful to use Irving Kaufman stuff.
Yeah, he definitely has that charisma and knowing how to put himself in the scene and to make himself look good.
Very sincere.
Yeah, so he understands the world of showbiz extremely well. And he made these. He whenever he gives these parliament speeches, right, in other countries, he always called on the national trauma of each country, right? So in the US Congress speech, he made reference to Pearl Harbor and 9/11. In Britain, he was channeling Winston Churchill and World War II. In Germany, he talked about the Berlin Wall. In Israel, he talked about the Holocaust, and so forth. I mean, he always draws on each country's national crisis and dilemma, and says that, well, look, I mean, this is where his country was foisted in involuntarily. It was Putin decided to invade. So definitely, I mean, Zelensky plays this role really well.
Yeah.
But as I said, he's only channeling his people. This is very important for me to say. So remember when he said that he's willing to negotiate with Russia on a peace treaty at some point in the future. But he said that whatever concession he decides to give, he's going to make it subject to a referendum that the Ukrainian people have to ratify. And that's incredibly smart, because it doesn't matter what concessions that he's going to make on the bargaining table. He knows that the Ukrainian people are never going to vote for that. And that's important, right? So It's about testing the will of the people. And why is it important to say it? Because you cannot negotiate with the people, right?
Mm.
The people are the ultimate sovereign. I mean, even if you have, let's say, 10% of the Ukrainian people who say it's not worth it to fight with Russians, and we have to, if the cost of life is restoring the Soviet Union, this might be a price worth paying. And I think there's a lot of Westerners who say that. I mean, Noam Chomsky is in effect saying that, and Richard David Brecht, the German philosopher, he was saying the same thing. He said the Ukrainians should lay down their arms. And there may be very few Ukrainians who are saying that now, but there might be some. But it's important that the vast majority of the Ukrainian people want to fight this war to the end.
Yeah, principle of hope. There's a principle of hope,
Yeah.
Hope in an optimistic outcome,
While I think that on the Russian side, I think that Putin is also wanting to fight this to the end, unfortunately. So I think the only way for this war to end is if there is a leadership change in Russia.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it would presumably be involuntary.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that you can use sweet words to Putin to come down from his high stage. So
agreed. Fully agree. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, within a few months, I think there will be a decision point, because without the full mobilization of the Russian society, I think that the Russian army will face complete collapse, and then at that point, I think that there will be a shift in the mood within the Russian leadership to basically end this war by stopping Putin ultimately. And right now, everybody's afraid of him now, right? He's an authoritarian leader. I mean, he doesn't listen to advice. His advisors are scared of him, so just like in the Stalin days. But remember, I mean, Stalin actually won the war. That's important to say that, right? He won the World War II. And that's why Putin was allowed Stalin was allowed to die of a natural death. Or at least, I don't know. Some people say that he was actually murdered by his doctor because Stalin became so paranoid, wanted to kill his doctor, and then the doctor was like, "All right, okay, let me stab him first," basically, right? But
all right, Larry.
Yeah. Okay, so you want to wrap this? I mean,
let's wrap it up.
Do you want to have any final thoughts? I mean, or on what's going to happen, and or do you want to?
We'll just have to see. It's hard to predict, really. We don't know. We can't predict the future, and there's a variety of outcomes of this, So I'm gonna stay silent. I don't know. I really don't know how this is gonna play out,
And also, I mean, I have to say, like, I'm not a good predictor in whatever sense, because I mean, if you had asked me in beginning of January, I was a little bit skeptical that the war would happen. I mean, I wrote a blog post at the end of January, and I said that an invasion was probable. That there was a lot of military analysts already stating that this was likely going to happen. And there was this one line in the conclusion that I actually regret writing in my blog, where I said that that Ukrainian neutrality, just like what we talked about with Austria, right? Austrian style neutrality could spare Ukraine from the fate of invasion.
Mm.
And that's a sentence I wrote at the end of that blog and at the end of January, and I reread it yesterday, and I regret having written
See,
that.
the third way is not always the best way.
I regret it because
Are you familiar with Giddens, The Third Way? That book, The Third Way. I'm not sure if you're
yes,
familiar with
yes,
it.
I'm familiar with Giddens' thesis. Yeah,
Yeah, this is different direction, but this is view that the mistake that even Europeans made is they assumed that there was a moderate way to deal with Russia, and sometimes there's only two choices. I guess we're given. Uh, what else I was going into? This whole discussion that we've been having, I've made me think about our hypotheses and our propositions are all really causal narrative based. We're constructing what we think are the causal narratives or what we think are the general historical narratives. And for our listeners, they are just that. They're just attempting to link or attempting to explain social phenomenon that we think we can tie in history. We think we can tie in political legacies, and we think that explains events, right? Or some convergence of events. So, but I like to use the word causal narratives. They're all we're talking about is still causal narratives. They're not, they can change. They can be incorrect. They might not. You know what I mean? They
right. You have the butterfly effect essentially, where
yeah,
you don't know
yeah, you
which
don't know.
butterfly is spreading out its wings and
Yeah.
creating a tsunami elsewhere, right? So,
Yeah, that's the thing with Geschichtswissenschaften and Geisteswissenschaften, which we're all in, right? The Germans have that term. That it's partly philosophical, partly sociology, partly political science. And in our discussion, we went, political economy. And so we're putting all these different disciplines together, and it becomes a kind of master analysis, if you like.
well, yeah, Dilthey's view. I mean, this guy
Yeah,
you're referring to, he called it like Geisteswissenschaft, which is the human sciences, and
yeah,
yeah, the reason why it's not causal, it's not natural science, it's because it deals with meaning, human meaning,
yeah.
and human interpretation ultimately, and it's interpretation and belief that is causing events to unfold. But people have different interpretations and different meanings, different they attribute um, different things to be important, right?
Yeah,
And
it
that
was.
itself changes the outcome, right?
It's very close to the Thomas theorem too, right? Men define situations as real; they are real in their consequences. So,
Right, the self-fulfilling prophecy,
yeah,
exactly.
the
And
problem.
that's
Yeah,
that's true ultimately, yes.
yeah,
And so that's what makes the predictions very difficult. But in any case, I mean, so the point I wanted to make, I mean, why was I wrong about the neutrality thesis?
yeah,
Um, it's because, yeah, that's because Russia doesn't want it ultimately. I mean, ultimately, the whole point is like, can we give the Russians something without selling the whole barn to the Russians?
yeah.
And I think that's the wrong way of looking at it because the Russians wanted everything.
Right.
I mean, it's basically, I mean, it's like,
A trap.
yeah, it's like a gangster who comes up to you and he says, basically, pay me money or I'm going to beat you up, right?
Yeah.
And
And people were like, "Let's negotiate this. Let's find a third way. Maybe there's some third principle."
there's no third way, essentially. I mean, either
Yeah,
you
yeah. There's
either
no
you give
moderate.
away your shop or you fight back, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and this is, I mean, this is like a slow, gradual trickle realization. It's because
yeah,
why is that? Well, I mean, people are smashing like Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime
yeah.
Minister in
Appeasement.
1938,
Yeah,
with the
appeasement. Yeah,
appeasement, and it's like, we give you
yeah,
Sudetenland, and and then please shut up about your imperial ambitions afterwards. And he wouldn't do it. I mean, Hitler wanted he wanted to own the world essentially.
Yeah.
And I understand where the British mindset was at that point. It was like, we just fought a freaking big war 20 years ago.
Yeah, we're gonna do what we need to, and
yeah, we don't want to fight this shit again, right?
yeah.
And
there's the trap right there. Yeah.
yeah, but then you have to fight it because the one aggressor wants to fight it, right?
Yeah,
that's the key.
right.
And that's the situation that we're in, and we hope that after the Russian defeat. So I was reading an article. This is the last point, promise.
Okay. Okay.
In the Wall Street Journal, where it was talking about comparing if Russia gets defeated, which I think is a possibility, that it's going to be the Suez Canal moment or the Spanish-American War moment to Russia.
Yeah, I agree.
Because after the Spanish-American War, the Spaniards were defeated, 1898. It was a triumph for the US imperialism because that's when it all started, right? But it stopped Spanish imperialism. And the French, British imperialism stopped in 56 when they lost in the Suez Crisis. And something similar is going to happen in Russia if Putinism gets defeated. That to me, I think that, I mean, whether it's a true thesis or not, I think it is credible thesis, and we have to hope that this is true because that's what's going to bring peace.
Yeah.
To Europe.
Good analysis.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
good ending. Good. That's it. All right.
Okay, good. So I'm gonna thank
no problem.
Mike Buhl here, and I'm gonna thank all my listeners for
my pleasure. It was my
listening
pleasure.
in.